talk about a concept that I've hinted at up there on the slide called potential GDP. That is, what would the economy look like if we used all of our resources to their potential? If unemployment, for example, were at 6 or 5% rather than the 8% that it is today. If factories were being used at their usual rate of utilization. That's what it would look like. Now, that's not a best fit line for those of you who like to do statistics or regression analysis. I didn't just fit that line. That's from a separate model. That's from asking what would the economy look like if we generate output with our usual level of resources rather than what we're doing now. It looks like a best fit line, but it's not. Now, the way economists use this information is to do the following. We ask, well, what's the difference between the red line and the blue line in percentage terms? We call that the output gap. Well, there's the output gap for the United States since 1981. Below zero is a recession. Notice that big jog down at the left-hand side. That's the 1981-83 recession. We were about 8% below what the economy could produce if it was doing its best. Notice we're back about that bad now, and we aren't getting that big V shape. So that's another thing you'll hear about a lot in the election. You'll hear about it on the pundits on radio and television and so on. You know, we're not getting that bounce back. I'll come back to that in a second. There's another picture that I want to show you that corresponds to this one. And in a sense, it looks like this one flipped on its head. So if you turn your head, you get a picture that looks like this. That's the unemployment rate. In fact, if you want to impress people at a party, that relationship is called Okun's Law. O-K-U-N, for Arthur Okun. There's a relationship between the output gap and unemployment. And some of you I know took macro from me, so if you don't remember that, I'm going to ask you after the talk. Remember Okun's Law? Well, there it is in strong force. When the output gap gets really negative, when we're way below potential, unemployment goes way up. Well, as Mike mentioned, I'm not just a macroeconomist. I'm at heart and in practice an economic historian, which means I want to help tell a story about what's going on. So let me tell you a story. My story is that we haven't had a recession like the one we're having since the Great Depression. And not just in its severity, but literally in the way the recession started, what was causing it. In particular, every recession from World War II until the current one was caused by the Federal Reserve. Now be careful, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I am not saying there was some nefarious plot in the halls of the Federal Reserve or something that caused this. What I'm saying is that the Federal Reserve, as part of its mandate, is supposed to prevent inflation. So every time inflation started to get higher, the Federal Reserve would raise interest rates in order to slow the economy down and get inflation back under control. Well, slowing the economy down to get inflation under control usually would throw the economy into a recession. Well, in a sense, that's kind of nice because when the inflation threat is passed, the Federal Reserve can simply take its foot off the monetary brake and let the economy get back to where it ought to be. Pretty nice. We are in that situation this time. We're in a different kind of recession. We're in a kind of recession that we haven't seen since the 1930s. We've seen all over the world in other places since the 1930s, but we haven't had one like this in the United States. And I think that has made a big difference. It's one reason why we're in a muddle. Our policymakers have never dealt with something like this before. And so they kind of grasp at straws and try to fit things into a narrative that may not be right. I'll come back to that a little later. What caused this one? Well, I think everyone knows the housing bubble popped on us. Now, was it a bubble? Some people said it wasn't at the time, that we could just have prices continue to go up and up and up. Well, I don't know. Here's an early version of a graph in the textbook that I work on. Yes, it should be starting at 100. That's why it's an early version, but it's the only one I could put in my talk without paying McGraw-Hill a royalty for my own book. So I thought, I'm just going to use the one that's in the draft. It gets at the general idea, which is house prices, on average, according to the Case-Shiller Index, had occasional bumps in it from the end of the Second World War, but all of a sudden in the late 90s they just took off. And what we saw was a bubble. And that collapsed starting in July of 2006. We reached a peak. And ever since then, housing prices have either been going down on average or maybe risen just a tiny bit here and there. That destroyed trillions of dollars of wealth. Now that shock was eased by monetary policy. The Federal Reserve did what it was supposed to do in the wake of that bubble bursting. They cut interest rates. They helped banks that were in distress. They did what the founders of the Federal Reserve back in 1913 thought the Federal Reserve would do most of the time, in fact. They weren't thinking about inflation back then. They were thinking about asset bubbles like the housing bubble and what could the Fed do to stop them. So the Fed did what it was supposed to do, but now a second shock. And it's interesting that we're here on September 14th. September 15th is kind of the economic day that will live in infamy. It's the day of Lehman Brothers and the day of the great meltdown on Wall Street in 2008. We had the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression sweep across the United States. Again, this is something that's happened in other parts of the world since World War II, but we had never seen it. And I think American policymakers were really caught off guard by it because they hadn't thought about this as a real possibility. It's always something that happens to somebody else. We can debate endlessly whether the reaction was right or wrong, done well or badly, but I think when you look back on it, the shock really was eased by the actions of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, by what we've come to be known as the TARP, the program to bail out the banks, by the Federal Reserve offering to take care of people's money market funds and so on. But what that involved was basically sending interest rates down to zero, where they've remained ever since. And so you've got a deep recession, and the only tool that you've got left is fiscal policy. That is, using tax cuts and spending increases to cushion the blow. Well, most of that, it turns out, despite what you've heard about stimulus plans and things like that, most of that has been through what economists call automatic stabilizers. Social Security payments, unemployment compensation, and things that are tied to the state of the economy and don't involve any action by the president, Congress, governors, legislators, anyone like that. It just happens. Now, one thing that I would like to spend a moment just pointing out. We've heard a lot of talk, I think, about exploding government. One of the things that you should ask yourself is, well, compared to what? And as an economist, we would ask, well, what has happened to government spending relative to that long-run red line, that potential I talked about a few minutes ago? Well, let me show you a picture. The red line on this one is what business investment should look like. Excuse me, what it actually looks like relative to potential. Business investment coming out of this recession is pretty typical for most recessions. Over on the far right side, you'll see it kind of go down, and then it starts to come up again, just like in previous recessions. This one only goes back to 1995, just to keep the graph from getting too out of hand. The two things that are anomalous are, number one, that green line on the bottom, that's new construction. And as I'm sure all of you know, that has fallen off a cliff. But the one on the top, though, is the one that I think surprises most people. If you ask, what's happening to government spending as a percentage of GDP, you would think that line ought to be taken off into the stratosphere. In fact, it's pretty steadily falling as a percentage of GDP. There was really no counterbalance to the decline in GDP on the part of government. Everything that the federal government has done in terms of stimulus has almost completely been offset by cuts at the local and state level. So the net effect has been very, very small in terms of any kind of stimulus. And in fact, I don't even like to use that word. I haven't come up with a very good one yet. The one I like to use is, it was a crash pad, right? Or an airbag in a car. We had two stimulus plans under President Bush and under President Obama, and all they did was keep us from hitting our head on the steering wheel too hard. They did not prevent the crash, and they didn't get us recovered after the crash. So, that leaves us with some points for discussion, and I'd like to have a conversation. Let me start out the discussion by thinking about a couple of options. One possibility is austerity. This is being pursued, especially in Europe, especially in Great Britain's probably the poster child for this. Didn't realize that. It's British Day. Government is the problem, to quote Ronald Reagan. Well, let's take a look at the latest employment report. Private sector generated a pretty anemic amount of jobs, 103,000 last month. The government shrank by 7,000. That's the 17th straight month of declines in government employment in the United States. The federal gained 3,000. So almost all of it, or basically all of it, came out of state and local. 6,000 of state, 4,000 of local. Here's my punchline for this slide. Education is where we are cutting government. This is the 23rd straight month of cuts to education employment in the United States. And pretty typically, half to two-thirds of all local government cutbacks are coming out of education. I would say that's eating our seed corn, but we can talk about that. So that's one possibility. We can continue on an austerity path. Stimulus, as I said, I don't care for that word much. Maybe government is at least part of the solution. But really, when you come right down to it, the question becomes, questions become, number one, do you believe there's a red line out there? Because maybe if you don't believe that, if you're saying we're condemned to the blue line, then we just have to live through this. But if you believe there's a red line, what can we do to get back to it? Austerity, stimulus, those are kind of big things. So let me offer a diagnosis and a couple of prescriptions. Mostly so that you can, I was looking to see if there's vegetables on the table to throw at me, so bars or whatever, throw brick ones. But here's how I see things. First of all, I think that consumers and businesses are not going to increase their spending on their own for the near future, for two reasons. One, there's just so much uncertainty and risk aversion out there, and you can pile up the reasons, but there just is a lot of uncertainty, and just being very careful about the world. And part of it is very rational. Housing wealth has been destroyed, and so they need to strengthen their balance sheets. Another part of this, though, is that the assets that they've got, they've wanted to change the way they hold it. They want to hold things that are safe. That's part of their risk aversion. They want to hold things that are like cash and treasury securities. Now, one possibility to get out of all this would be to crank up exports. And I'd say, yeah, that'd be great. The problem is exports take time to crank up. You can't just all of a sudden start selling things abroad. So that's not going to get us out of this in the short term. It's an excellent prognosis for the long term, but it's not going to have a big impact, say, in the next 6 months to 18 months. So here's the first policy prescription. A large percentage of homeowners are, for all practical purposes, either underwater or close to it. They're treading water on their mortgages. They're not going to do any spending until they get that fixed up. Our government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they hold a large portfolio of the mortgages. So my first policy prescription would be that we offer immediate refinancing to all homeowners who are current on their mortgages. We've got to just admit to ourselves that we've got a problem. We've taken a big loss, and we're going to have to write it down one way or another. The question is, who's going to take the hit? And I would argue we're all going to have to take the hit together. We can talk about it.